Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next panel, where we will debate the question, can we still dream of a sovereign European supply chain for SAF? My name is Gesche Wipper. I work for the German financial newspaper Börsenzeitung, and I'm also a member of the French Aviation Journalists Association, AGPAE. That's why I'm here. But let us welcome the panelists. And first of all, I would like to welcome Julie Kitcher, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of Airbus. And then next, I would like to say thank you to Brian Morin. He was the Chief Sustainability Officer of Boeing. I'm very happy you could make it after the events of yesterday. So maybe...
Yeah, well, thank you. And as many in other panels have said, our hearts just go out to the victims, to the families, and all those impacted of Air India Flight 171 yesterday. Just before this meeting, I just want to thank my colleagues, every one of them, and throughout the day you could hear this. This industry rallies when tragic events like this happen. And I just want to thank my colleagues for the warm words.
Thank you for being here. Next to me is Layirura Ranasinghe. He's the Director of Sustainability of EasyJet. And then over there is Sylvain Caballery, who's the Senior Vice President Sustainable Fuels at Technip Energies. And Technip Energies, just to make a little introduction, they are not producers of SAF, but they offer the technologies which you need to produce SAF.
So we are a leading technology and engineering company, and we deliver industrial scale projects worldwide, historically in the LNG oil and gas space, and we have moved towards sustainable fuels, sustainable chemicals, circularity, green hydrogen, and so on. So we are not a SAF producer, we are not a SAF user, but we are a SAF enabler. We are part of the solution, as we say internally.
Very interesting. So let's start with the discussion. Where do we stand at the moment when it comes to SAF production in Europe? How much does Europe produce at the moment, and where will it go up to this year until 2030? Maybe, Julie, could you give an overview?
Okay, so thank you. Thank you, Gesche. Well, I would say the good news is that SAF on a global level has doubled over the last 12 months. The bad news is that's still well below 1% of the global fuel usage by airlines in a 12-month period. So we're on a trajectory. Is it enough? Absolutely not. Is it going fast enough? Absolutely not. Can we accelerate it? Yes, we can. And I think when you look at the requirement by 2030, just in big numbers, if we were to say, I use the UK as an example actually, if we're going to meet 10% of sustainable aviation fuel on a global level by 2030, I know the European mandate's 6%, and there are different figures around the world, not necessarily mandates, but commitments or discussions ongoing. But assume 10%, that would require 34 million tons of sustainable aviation fuel. And we're projected to be at around 1.5 million this year. So you can see that there's a lot to do. That said, actually in terms of the European mandate, I think we're relatively confident that by 2030 we can get there in terms of the absolute production required to meet the 6% for bio SAF, so not e-fuel. That's another topic, and we can probably talk about that later. But certainly from a HEFA production pathway, bio SAF capacity is on track for 2030. The biggest issue is that 34 million tons globally in 2030 needs to be double that value in 2035. So the growth is exponential, and the question is how do we now collaborate and work together to grow these projects at scale so that our airline customers can have sustainable aviation fuel at an affordable price?
And Brian, how do you judge the situation
Yeah,
in Europe.
very
at the
similar to
moment.
Julie. I think the numbers are what they are. If you look at 2050, so Julie did a great job talking about 2030 and the mandates there. Out to 2050, we're going to need about 45 million tons of SAF here in Europe, and that breaks down about 20 million HEFA, because there's also an incentive to transition to e-fuels, right or wrong. About 19 million tons in e-fuels, and then the rest in conventional fuels. And for that total amount of SAF, the amount of renewable electricity you'll need is 750 terawatt hours, which is roughly the amount of 2 times the energy use of France on a given year. And so I think what we may also talk about is just the interplay between energy and aviation, because this renewable electricity is the same electricity that automotive is claiming. The green hydrogen is the same green hydrogen that steel and aluminum will go after. And so I think the interplay is something we have to be very sober about. And one of the things we have to do is always remind ourselves of the economic and social benefit of aviation and hold those up, because we don't enough talk about that in forums like these. We only talk about the challenge, but not about the upside. So that's one thing that we're very focused on, is try to figure out the economic opportunity, the hundreds of thousands of jobs that can be created through a SAF supply chain, and that intrinsically aviation enables.
Yeah, and Sylvain, you could give us maybe a comparison with the rest of the world. Where does Europe stand? How?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to give you a perspective, today Technip Energies, we are working roughly on 20 projects on sustainable aviation fuel worldwide, representing 7 million tons. So we see a dynamic. We have a lot of conversation with clients. In Europe, we are working with the big names, with Neste, who is the world's largest sustainable fuel provider, Total Energies, Galp, and so on. But we have more and more conversation in Australia, in the US, in Singapore, and in India. And we see those countries are they want to benefit from the mandate of EU and UK by producing locally and then exporting to EU. So it's also the time for EU to wake up, so that we can create a sustainable fuel supply chain and to have a ripple effect of all the benefit of it, because it's creating a lot of jobs, and I can come back to that afterwards to give you some figures as well.
And do you think at the moment we have enough SAF production in Europe to fulfill the mandates or not? If it goes up like, yeah.
So today we don't have enough, and I think that everybody is aligned with that. We see a strong will. The mandates are clear, bad or wrong, but good or. I mean, we can debate on the e-fuel, as you said earlier, on the SAF, but the mandates are there. The will is there, but we are seeing some obstacles to that, from a technology standpoint, and it's where we are bringing our share, from a regulatory standpoint, and from a financing standpoint.
Do you think the same?
Yes and no. So I'm just thinking about what Sylvain said, and we have a pipeline in Europe that, as Julie also said, we can scale up to meet European demand. It's not there yet, and of course, especially in the UK, we are very reliant on imports. Now, one thing that we do have to bear in mind is that while we're looking at this in terms of the next 5 to 10 years, ultimately, what we need to get to is a global solution to a global challenge in a global industry. And for SAF to really work, we need to have maximum liquidity right across the market. It needs to turn into a globally tradable commodity. So there's definitely a role for imports into into EU and the UK, but also we need to have the homegrown production scaling up so that this region is able to play a part in that transition as well. Because there are, but I definitely would still argue for the imports being a part of the mandates being fulfilled in the short and medium term, because there are many angles at play here. First and foremost is the decarbonization of this industry, and from an environmental perspective, that is absolutely what we need to achieve. There's then, of course, the economic aspect of this region has a huge opportunity to take part in this supply chain, and not just in production of SAF, but right across the value chain, including being enablers such as what Sylvain is doing. So, short answer is there's not enough just yet, but there is already the flow of SAF across borders that's adapting to this global demand and supply. Other countries, including our own, have an opportunity and need to scale up to meet that and play a part in it.
So let's say maybe in 2030, how dependent will Europe be then on imports?
Depends on how well we scale up production in Europe, and that's the billion-dollar question, or the multiple billion-dollar question. But we see that the mandates provide the certainty of demand, and just the mandates are on the fuel suppliers. And in terms of how many airlines, ourselves included, how we fulfill them is by purchasing compliant fuel from the suppliers, your Totals, Air BPs, etc. We are already purchasing that SAF. We're already purchasing the compliant fuel. We're already paying that premium for it. What we are seeing in terms of the supply scaling up to meet what we need to buy ultimately, though, is that upfront risk. That and I'm guessing that Sylvain is much more qualified to talk about it than myself. But it's getting those projects off the ground, getting them to a risk profile that unlocks the investment, the private sector investment that's needed to get those projects up and running. Because if you look at the forecast and the pipeline, and Fuels Europe released a report just a few weeks ago, the pipeline is there, provided that we're able to unlock those investments to get to final investment decisions and to get spades in the ground. So it's not an easy answer to give, because it is dependent on how well we take those first steps to unlock those projects.
Can I build on that just a second? Because I think we're always very much focused on mandates, but actually what we need is supply side incentives as well as demand incentives. So in Europe, we've got the mandate, 6%, and then growing thereafter. So we need 50%, 70% by 2050. But what's really missing now is a revenue pricing mechanism. And so we need we need to reconcile the timelines between the production timeline, where producers need offtake guarantees, so they need multi-year visibility to be able to make the investments, which are substantial, to get even before they get to FID. So we're talking about substantial, $1 billion in cash required, probably pre-FID, and then post-FID, you're 3 to 5 years before there's any meaningful SAF delivered in any quantity. So they really need financing and security, longevity and visibility in their business models. Yet, from an airline perspective, they're buying short. So how do you reconcile this long-term pipeline required for offtakes with the short-term spot price fuel purchase, where today we don't have a commodity pricing for sustainable aviation fuel? It's clearly a nascent technology that comes with lots of advantages, so investment, job creation, a new economy, energy optionality, and therefore sovereignty. But at the same time, when you're having those conversations from a financial perspective with your risk management boards as a bank or as an investor, and it's a first-of-a-kind investment, you need some way to be able to hedge the risk on that investment. So we're very much calling for an intermediary support to be able, or if you like, a dual auction mechanism whereby you can hedge that timeline between the development cycle and the spot purchase at scale.
Brian, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, in preparation for this panel, I kept tripping up over the word sovereign. In the security room next door, for obvious reasons, there's a lot being talked about European sovereignty and defense and security and data privacy. But in this space, as you said, this is a global industry, and nobody asks if where Total Energy gets its oil from. It gets it all from all over the world. So the idea that we have to create an exclusively domestic supply chain, I think, is the wrong question. That said, and at Boeing, for instance, we partner with Norsk E-Fuels up in Norway, in partnership with Norwegian Airlines, in partnership with the MOD, because they're recognizing that from an energy security perspective, it's useful to have domestic production. So same thing in Firefly in the UK, a new novel pathway that we're helping certify through the University of Sheffield. Sky Energy out of the Netherlands, we helped them in the Netherlands, and then we took them to the United States because that's where the incentives were. And guess what? Some of that fuel may get produced there and shipped here. From a life cycle intensity perspective, it's not ideal, but it's doable, just like oil moves freely all around the globe. So I think we got to be careful that we don't narrow ourselves down so much here in Europe that the perfect becomes the enemy of the good, just like what happened with feedstock, right? There was a rush to ban a bunch of feedstock in the spirit of indirect land use change and competing with food, when in fact there are certification mechanisms that can certify that it's either, it's sustainable or it's not. There are standards that solve for that. Guillaume Faury, my final point, made an excellent intervention this morning in the amphitheater, talking about the need for harmonization and around SAF standards even. So this idea of just being uniquely European, I think, is taking us down the wrong trail.
But I think there's the fear to be too dependent on importations. And so maybe, Sylvain, what do you think about that?
I think we can do both. We can increase the local production so that we can reduce our dependency on external importation, because today jet fuel, ultimately, as we don't produce oil in Europe, I mean we produce in UK and in Norway, but not in Europe, it's 100% imported from the feedstock standpoint. So we can reduce that dependency, but I agree with you that we cannot aim to have 100% of the SAF production needed in Europe manufactured in Europe or supplied from Europe. And I agree with all what was said earlier about the constraints on certification, the constraints on financing, on first-of-a-kind projects. Because if we want the industry to take off in Europe, but outside of Europe as well, we need to simplify and we need to help the people that want to bring projects, that want to develop projects. We have to help them. Because most of the time, the problem is not the technology. The problem is, how do I guarantee to my finances, to my debt holders, that ultimately I will sell my product at a certain price for the next 25 years, and that the output from my plant will reach that level. And we are playing our part, you guys are playing your part, but we need also, I would say, public support to play a role in that, so that they can help financing those new scale plans.
And maybe a bit more, I would say, a bit more flexibility in the approach. I think we've all underestimated the impact in terms of volume of sustainable aviation fuel we can have through co-processing. So that's something that can be done relatively easily from an existing refinery. So that means that the sustainable, the bio feedstock is mixed with the crude oil before it goes into the refinery, and actually that can create quite a substantial volume. And then at the same time, we tend to hear, HEFA bio-SAF, and then eSAF, so power to liquid, where you use green hydrogen and combine it with CO2 captured from the atmosphere to create an e-synthetic fuel, which is going to be energy intensive, very, very costly. But at the same time, we have other production pathways that can be promoted. I mean, in the European mandate, we have basically HEFA predominantly now till 2030, and then an e-fuel mandate. But we could encourage, gasification through Fischer-Tropsch or alcohol to jet, which is a very promising pathway. So we're working with the ASTM to get these different pathways certified and have more optionality with respect to the feedstock and then the volume of sustainable aviation fuel that's available. So I think, when you listen to all of us, essentially we need all of the above. It's a multifaceted set of solutions to this global issue in terms of sustainability criteria, in terms of feedstock availability, production pathways, and then the right business case so that the airline can put sustainable aviation fuel in the tank at scale. Because the reality is today, our aircraft can fly with 50% sustainable aviation fuel today. It's not a fuel for tomorrow, it's a fuel for today. But we need to get the business model right.
Maybe to come back to the first question, why it is important for Europe to have its own SAF production. At EasyJet, are you looking where you buy the SAF from where it comes, or doesn't it play a role at all?
I mean, like I said before, we buy the SAF through the suppliers, so we get the visibility of where it's of where it's coming from, but provided it meets the sustainability standards, provided it's compliant with RED II, for example. We are agnostic as to where that fuel comes from. I think, again, getting to Brian's point, it's if this is going to succeed as a solution for aviation, we do have to create a global market. And the question really is, how does Europe and the UK become a part of that global market? Yes, energy security is definitely a part of it, and the economic value. But it's about participating in a global market, which also has imports from other countries, as opposed to it being a case of closing the borders. And just to put a bit of context around also the costs and the affordability, our profit margin, we are a very profitable airline, but our profit margin per seat is a little over £6. This morning when I got to Paris, don't judge me for this, but I did have a chocolate eclair and a coffee, which cost more than the £6 that we make out of each seat. That's the kind of margin that we're looking at. So while there is an additional cost to SAF, which we recognize, there's also the risk of relative costs. Because if we get our SAF at, let's say, $3,000 a ton, and our competitors are then later able to get it at $2,500, that £6 per seat gets eroded very, very quickly. And this is the reason why we don't buy jet fuel years in advance. We hedge, that's a financial instrument, but we don't buy the jet fuel way in advance as well, because there's the risk of relative disadvantage because of fluctuations in the market. And that is what then leads us also to the question of, well, why don't airlines commit to 10-year offtakes and so on? You should be able to immediately see how, especially when we're talking about very expensive fuels, especially in the case of power-to-liquid fuels, a small relative change in that flight, a small percentage change, takes that £6 out straight away. And this is where, again, I would also echo Julie's thoughts about the market intermediary, helping to aggregate both the demand and supply and stimulate the market, the creation of that market, as proposed by Project Skypower as well, in the case of ESAF, power-to-liquid, that is a really important step forward to help to get to those levels that we see the pipeline can get to, provided that the mechanisms are put in place.
Wanted
Yeah,
to
I
say
was just
something.
going to add about the Skypower initiative. That's also where aggregated demand is key. So the more you can pledge at the same time, obviously, the more economies of scale that you can achieve, and that's where the book and claim system is, in our view, key. Because there will be a number of places in the world where you don't have SAF available at scale. So rather than shipping it and deteriorating the life cycle analysis of your sustainable aviation fuel, well, it works very much like a renewable energy certificate. So an airline or an operator can purchase a certain proportion of sustainable aviation fuel, get a certificate for it, registered in an agreed registry, but actually the sustainable aviation fuel is flown in another tank somewhere else in the world, and then you can have a Scope 1 certificate for your CO2 emissions as an airline, and then have a Scope 3 certificate, a corresponding Scope 3 certificate, for example, for business travel. So I think this is where we need to become much more innovative with these tools and work with policymakers to ensure that they're acceptable tools to be able to use in addition to physical SAF in the tank for every airline.
Both of you, Airbus and EasyJet and also Boeing, are members of some industry bodies who published or commissioned a report on SAF, which was published in the beginning of the year. And there you criticized that there are some threats in Europe, especially for the SAF production. So what are the political threats you mention in this report?
Can you humor us with specifics on which report you're referring to? Do you remember?
Wait a moment. It's a report which was commissioned by Airlines for Europe.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Look, and Destination 2050 is sort of the umbrella roadmap that Airlines for Europe has put out, and it has a really good set of policy recommendations. I don't know that it necessarily criticizes, but it just laments the fact that we're not moving with pace on the policy front. Julie already talked about things like a revenue certainty mechanism that's being consulted on right now, and it's going to be, it's a second reading now in the UK, it's going to be put into law where you de-risk the top and the bottom. So if the price of SAF rises above a certain point, an incentive kicks in to keep the price below a certain, at a certain level. And if it falls, it's the opposite. There are opportunities in the EU through, for instance, the free allowances in the EU emissions trading scheme. There were, I think, from memory now, 1.5 million or so allowances put out, which is a start, but it doesn't come anywhere close to, for instance, a blender's tax credit that existed in the United States, and that's up for renewal right now. And believe it or not, even in this administration, it's in the current tax bill that's going through Congress, that 45Z tax extension is in there because they recognize the economic opportunity of investing in SAF, and it's really a bipartisan issue. So I think there's a number of policy interventions that could be accelerated, if you will, here in Europe that would help us scale faster than what we're currently doing.
Sylvain,
you have also the global view on it.
No, I think that we speak a lot about the cost of SAF. And what we see on our own projects, whether it's HEFA or Alcohol-to-Jet, where we have our own technology, is that at every project we learn. At every project we are able to be faster to market, cheaper to execute, and so on and so forth, because we use the same supply chain, our engineers get trained, and so on. So ultimately the cost will go down because we will be more efficient in our in capital expenses. So that's why we need to sustain to support the industry now that it's taking off. It's the right time to do it, because if we wait too long, we will never be able to get the cost down, and then we'll go into the circle, or it's too expensive, and it's too expensive, therefore we don't do it, and we don't do it, and therefore it still remains expensive, and so on and so forth. And if you look at the renewable electricity 15 years ago, it's what happened. It was very expensive, and then the cost went down. Because they got the mechanism that you were talking about, the compensation for difference, and the supply chain followed, and they get volume, and they get expertise, and so on and so forth. So today is the time.
It feels like it always, like a boomerang, comes back around to the aggregation, because that anticipation that project number 2 will be more efficient and cost effective than project number 1, and 3 will be better than 2, etc., which makes it so challenging to put money into project number 1. And absolutely agree with everything that's said, which is why, again, that aggregation and the ability to spread the risk amongst both the demand side and the supply side, we believe is absolutely critical to getting the production up in this region, but not just in this region, on a global scale, to be able to create this market.
And you already said the industry should be able to attract more private investors to SAF. Do you have any recommendations how that could be done, or any ideas? Or
Well, I think this revenue pricing mechanism is key, and I think that honestly the UK has the opportunity to really do something extremely meaningful for the industry, given that it has the mandate and an accompanying revenue pricing mechanism. So I think we should see some real uptick coming in the UK. And I think, going back to the question, well, is there a real place for Europe in this market? I would dare to say if there isn't, then there'll be a huge place for Asia, because the growth, when we look out 20 years with respect to air travel, the biggest proportion of growth is going to come from the Asia-Pacific region. When you look at their feedstock availability, it's absolutely huge. When you look at the different discussions around the globe now, Japan, South Korea, we see mandate discussions taking place, India too, Singapore, which has been really quite innovative with passenger levy to be applied for the uptake of sustainable aviation fuel, and the levies collected by the central government to be invested into sustainable aviation fuel. The speed of growth as well in renewables in China, there will be a huge opportunity with this sustainable aviation fuel technology and industry that's evolving. And so if Europe doesn't move and scale, then they'll miss, I would say we will miss a big opportunity.
I'll give an example. Sky Energy, the company I mentioned earlier out of the Netherlands, we work with them and are still in the Pacific Northwest because there, this tax incentive I talked about, it gets doubled. You get the federal and then the state doubled it. So you actually close that green premium between SAF and jet quite nicely. We did a prepaid offtake agreement with them several years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, which was somewhat unorthodox because we're prepaying fuel for our own use years ahead of when they even have the facility to produce it and send it to us. But we believed in them, we worked with them, and it was a bit of an experiment. That backing allowed them to go later on to Macquarie, and not exclusively Boeing, but I think that demand signal that Boeing would partner with them. They went to Macquarie, an infrastructure fund, who invested in the company to the tune of 250 million euros. And they just did their second round. They raised 300 million euros from the Dutch pension scheme. So there is money and sort of infrastructure money that's starting to see, this circle closing between certainty, demand signals, and frankly, technical capability, because we've proven out a number of these pathways now. There's not a technical challenge anymore. I'm actually quite optimistic that we have all the ingredients in front of us, but combining them, having long enough demand signals and having policy certainty that extends beyond 2 or 3 years, and we know what to do.
And I think we see more and more innovative solutions evolving. I talked about book and claim. We've put together a SAFA fund, so a Sustainable Aviation Fuel Fund, as an anchor investor in Airbus, but with a number of partners, airlines, banks, and investors. So to be able to invest in actually quite technologically advanced stage sustainable aviation fuel projects. And we see a number of different initiatives like that growing. So now, I think, to echo the points here, we really see the start of a new industry evolving. So it's time to accelerate.
Sylvain, from Technip's point of view, do you have any recommendations what could be done?
Yeah, I think we need to simplify the life of the investors, of the developers, because we worked with Sky Energy, we work with project developers like Sky Energy, we work with established companies like Neste or Total Energies, and when we hear all their challenges, it's horrendous. You cannot imagine the number of constraints they have, the complexity of certificate. Yeah, the permitting, the site access, the feedstock competition, as you mentioned earlier, the certification, the traceability, and so on and so forth. So we really need to work all together to simplify their life, so that ultimately they can accelerate developments. Because today, and it's valid in Europe, but it's valid outside Europe. And I had a discussion a couple of weeks ago with the chairman of the largest jet fuel producer in India. And he told me, I want to invest in SAF. I want to invest in alcohol-to-jet solutions. I have asked my teams to explain to me and to reassure me on the certification and traceability and make sure that I can sell it in Europe or I can even invest in Europe. No one has been able to explain it to me in a simple terms. So now I said to my team, okay, let's shelve it, and maybe in a year or two, when it's clear for you guys, you come back to me. And this is where we are. So it's so complex. We have made it too complex. We wanted to make, the perfection is the enemy of the good, as we said.
So the other, you said already that there will be a big chance otherwise for Asia to become a big. So what are they doing better than Europe?
I think they're very organized. They're fast when they make a decision. They have a wealth of feedstock, and they have an appetite to grow emerge new industries and new technologies. I'm not saying that Europe hasn't done some of the right things and is missing an opportunity. I think Europe was the first mover with respect to the mandate. We've got SAF allowances in the ETS. So there are some elements there, but we're missing the equation on the revenue pricing mechanism side. So it's really about speed, I would say, and really bridging the gap. And I think maybe if we could just take a step back for a minute, why are we talking about sustainable aviation fuel? As an aviation industry, we know the benefits of this industry in terms of the connection, in terms of the economic contribution to GDP. 4% of global GDP comes through aviation, job creation, close to 90 million jobs. So it's an industry that's absolutely worth protecting and supporting. And it's probably one of the only industries that has a global goal, if you like, sectorial goal, to get to net zero 2050 with clear levers where you'll see all the players in the ecosystem aligned on what these levers are and what needs to be done to get there. So the first is obviously advanced technology, latest generation aircraft and technology, and that's directly in the OEM's hands with the supply chain in terms of the, making sure that we can deliver on the backlogs and then developing next generation technology. Because for every new generation of aircraft we introduce, you reduce fuel emissions and therefore CO2 by 25% from one generation to the next. And the next biggest lever is sustainable aviation fuel. And it can be flown today. And so we have a credible pathway. That's why we're pushing so hard to develop this sustainable aviation fuel industry, because it's a game changer to decarbonize aviation. And then on top, you can talk about enhanced air traffic management. You can talk about carbon capture, which is going to be essential because there'll still be some residual emissions that we need to remove. But we have a collective goal and a collective vision, if you like, in terms of how to meet that goal. And SAF is absolutely fundamental to that vision.
Just going to the other end of that value chain as well, as Julie alluded to, aviation has a massive socioeconomic impact, and we're looking at unlocking something like 90 million jobs worldwide. That's roughly the same as the population of Germany. So it is a massive force for good in that sense, and keeping aviation affordable, keeping flying affordable is also a part of that equation. And I mean, of course, I'm going to say that because our entire mission is to democratize air travel as an airline. But it is important that we consider that aspect of it as well when we are putting in place the policies and when we are looking at the mechanisms with which we uplift sustainable aviation fuel and how that gets passed through to the end customer. Just to build something on something else Julie said as well, is what we are trying to do on our side is to make ourselves as energy efficient as possible, and that includes buying the latest aircraft that we have. So we've got almost 300 NEO aircraft on order. It's about operating those aircraft as efficiently as possible, and it's also about air traffic control. Now, this might sound weird, air traffic control being mentioned in a conversation about SAF, but the reality of it is we've got demand for about 4 million tons of SAF just in Europe, give or take, to meet the mandates by 2030. a 10% reduction in fuel burn through airspace modernization would mean that we need 300,000 to 400,000 tons less of SAF. And what that translates to is several billion dollars, pounds, euros worth of investments that's needed to fill that gap in SAF production. So we do have to look at this on a holistic level as well in terms of the decarbonization and the overall energy value chain and the energy ecosystem.
Yeah, makes sense to me. So thank you. And when it comes to, do you have an idea how the US are supporting their SAF production? Is there something we could copy maybe in Europe, which would be good?
Well, I mentioned the tax credit a couple times, this blender's tax credit, which is exactly that. It's a tax savings, tax incentive to produce SAF based on, and the credit gets higher the better the fuel is. So the more your life cycle savings, the more money you get in that incentives. And that's being up for renewal. And as I said earlier, it's making it through Congress in a bipartisan fashion. And then many states that have decarbonization targets or just energy diversification targets, like Texas. Think about Texas. It's not a necessarily blue state. They're one of the world leaders in renewables because they see it as a diversification play, and they're attracting all kinds of investment in data farms and other new tech because they have the energy. So I think thinking different, as I said in my opening remarks, about energy. Because back to this sovereign European supply chain, if we keep constraining the feedstock artificially, even though it's sustainable, but for all kinds of political reasons, the Renewable Energy Directive wants to narrow it down. And then we also struggle on the energy side, as I said earlier, but mandate a 35% PTL target by 2050. It doesn't square. We won't get there. So I think being a bit more open-minded, and I like what Julie said about Singapore. They're so pragmatic there. This tax that she talked about, it's a pilot. And I met with the minister, and he's like, yeah, we're just going to try. We're going to collect $3 for an economy ticket, up to $16 for a business class ticket. That's not going to break anybody's bank. We're going to put it in a pot, see how much we get, and then we're going to buy SAF with that. And we're going to put that in the fuel farm, and we're going to aim to get to about 1% by 26, 3% by 2030. If it doesn't work, we're going to adjust. So I think this pragmatism of, okay, let's not solve for 2050, even though we know what the goal is, we know where we're aiming, and that's not changing. But just to incrementally work our way towards that is a really refreshing way of doing business.
And we could do it with the ETS. You could, if you include aviation in the industrial European industrial strategy, and then extend the SAF allowances in the ETS scheme, and then the money that you collect from the aviation industry as part of that ETS scheme, you re-inject into a fund or into providing this market mechanism that's required to bridge the gap between the long and the short trades that I explained earlier. That would be a real start to be able to close that financing gap and get the larger aggregated demand that we need to get SAF at scale.
I have a look at the clock and it's ticking off. So maybe to make a little conclusion from everybody, do you think it's possible, or what should Europe do to have its sovereign SAF production? You already said it, but maybe just a short summarizer for everybody.
I can start from the start. I think what's positive in all the conversation is that we all want to do SAF. We all want the industry to take off. We have the industrial base in Europe. We have the suppliers. We have the brain, and we have the plane. So from brain to plane, we can do it in Europe. Now it's a question of helping the industry, supporting the industry with all the mechanisms that we have discussed, and removing the obstacles. Some are more difficult than others, but I think that collectively we can find the solutions, and I'm very hopeful, not only from a business standpoint, but also from a sustainable standpoint. And I see the strong will of everybody in the industry. No one is saying, no, it's impossible. No one is saying, we have a technology blocker, or we have this, or plane cannot fly, and so on. Everybody is part of the solution. So we can make it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the technology is key. We've got the technology in the aircraft. We've got the technology in the SAF production system. So the technology is there and will be a game changer. I think, taking it back again to a global level, which is the role that ICAO plays, or l'OSI in French, is absolutely key to be able to have this global level playing field with respect to SAF criteria, SAF certification. So support of CORSIA is really important to be able to have a world or a global system, and not limited to a regional system, which is perhaps stricter in Europe than elsewhere, because we need to start and we need to really scale. We need to bear in mind that we're solving a global issue, so climate change and CO2 is a global issue. We need a global solution, yet we see very much borders emerging with respect to how the regulations play out. And so let's solve a global issue with a global solution, and be pragmatic. We need interoperability of these regulations and norms to be able to really make a big difference. But I share your optimism, and 2050 may seem like a really long way away, but actually keep in mind the life cycle of an aircraft. The average life cycle of an aircraft is 22.5 years. So actually that's 2 product life cycles max. One product life cycle, but one incremental product life cycle. So we've got today's that we're delivering, plus one more before we get to 2050. So it's actually the day after tomorrow in aviation language.
Brian and Layou, we don't have much time. I'm sorry. So quick.
Just quickly, I would, as I said earlier, take the sovereign out. Let's have Europe be a really strong player globally on SAF. If Airbus can invest in SAF in America, and if Boeing can invest in SAF in Europe, that's what makes this industry so beautiful. It's a global industry. So I'm still against the sovereign word in that title, but it was a really fun panel. Thank you, Gesche.
I think there's a tendency to see sustainability only as a challenge, but it also opens up massive opportunities. I mean, Europe doesn't have oil. Sustainable aviation fuels actually create an opportunity for Europe to play a role in a global market. So let's embrace those opportunities and protect this amazing industry that we've created, and make it better and make it sustainable for future generations.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gesche.
And thank you for this optimistic view. So we are optimistic we can reach it.
Thank you, Gesche.
Thank you.
Thank you.